You're back on the Mountain Morning Show, and I'm very thrilled to introduce to you our next guest. If you haven't seen him on either Terry Burden's show or ours this morning, we have in studio with us author Stephen Tryon of Accountability, Citizenship, a wonderful book, and it's just small enough to, take wherever you want with you in terms of getting an update in terms of what you need to know about how you can get more involved with your congressman in terms of making those changes that you want to see. Welcome back to the show, Stephen. How are you this morning?
I'm doing great. Thanks again
Wonderful.
for having me on, Chelsea. And a shout out, Accountability Citizenship is in Dolly's down on Main Street. So
perfect.
Great Park City business. Like to thank them for having the book on their shelves.
Very good. And I know last time when you spoke with Joe, we had a great discussion with you. We kind of want to continue along that same vein, then also talk briefly about Congress and the budget and what's going on with that. And so first off, give us a little bit about your background for those who weren't able to tune into that first interview we had with you.
Well, I spent 21 and a half years as a soldier. And so as a soldier, I graduated from West Point in 1983, just celebrated my 30th reunion with my classmates here a few weeks ago.
That's amazing. Wonderful.
We had a great time.
Good.
And of course, as an officer and a soldier, I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And I wrote Accountability Citizenship because I feel that we've changed the way we market and distribute information over the course of the past 40 or 45 years. And I believe that we haven't kept up as citizens with the way we market and distribute information. Those changes to the way we market and distribute information, I believe, discourage effective citizenship. And I believe they create a sense of hopelessness and frustration in the American people that is a threat to our Constitution. It causes people to be more extreme than they would otherwise be. So what I offer in the book is a toolkit to get around that.
Very good. And as I was kind of leafing through the pages and reading some things here and there, a thought that came to my mind in terms of how technology, and my first thought was, well, over the years, our ability to interact with people has just exploded. I mean, we just instantly, we can and should, hopefully, I wish we could get responses from our government officials, and I wish that that does allow for it, and I wish that could happen, but in reality, it doesn't really all the time. So my thought was, well, not so much how should technology or how has that changed it, but how should it change that interaction between us and our government officials? And you have some thoughts on that.
That's a terrific point, Chelsea. And I think actually technology can make our democracy and our republic more powerful than it's ever been before. In Accountability Citizenship, I acknowledge that the volume of information that confronts us is overwhelming today, more so than ever before. And so I advocate time management principles, establishing priorities, and using those priorities as a way of actively engaging the information stream and getting a balanced view of what your priority issues are. Not just going to where your comfort zone is, but getting a balanced view, going to the people that you disagree with and listening to what they have to say. Because we've been wrong in our history, profoundly wrong. And I use the history of civil rights and the history of women's suffrage as two examples of cases where all the way up to the Supreme Court, we made wrong decisions that disenfranchised women and that disenfranchised people of color in this country for a good part of our history, for most of our history. So I believe that it's important for us to use time management principles to focus on our priority. It's important to use good critical reasoning skills to get a balanced view of the issues once we understand what our priorities are. And then I advocate engaging and using the information technology to engage. Specifically, my number one priority is transparency. And members of Congress can change their websites. They can bring their websites into the 21st century using the same technology that you and I use when we go to the bank online, which I do frequently. You can log in with your voter registration number and your ID or a password, in the case of our senators and our representatives, and then you can share with them your views, get back from them a picture of what the rest of their constituents are saying. So there's no reason why. I mean, my bank does that for me every day. They'll give me little surveys and they'll immediately pop a response that shows what everybody else has said about that question. And there's no reason why we can't have that same kind of transparency with our members of Congress. Members of Congress won't like that because it takes away their role as information brokers to some extent. It takes away some of their power. Knowledge is power. But that's the kind of transparency that we should demand as citizens, and we have the power to do that.
And Stephen, in your thoughts on transparency, both in what you've said and in your book, obviously when people are demanding transparency, I would think for the most part their mindset is they're very involved or they want to know what's going on. But sometimes there's those of us who are so fed up and just all that fighting, all the infighting going on, you just lay back and you're like, I'm cutting myself off from it. I'm so sick of it. But why should we be demanding that transparency and not become apathetic about that our relationship with our congressman?
Well, you know, what's happening in the news right now is a great example of that. You know, here we are on September 27th, and we don't have a budget to fund the government for the fiscal year that starts on October 1st. And that's a failure. That's a failure on the part of Congress to do one of its most basic functions. And there's absolutely no reason why we should be there. The reason we're here is because we've allowed the process of budgeting to become politicized to the point where it's being used as a bargaining chip. Essentially, you've got people that are in the minority on some issues, and they're holding a gun to the head of the American people, essentially, by saying we're not going to fund the government unless you, the majority, change. You know, specifically, and I don't like to talk about it as a healthcare issue because it's not a healthcare issue, and it's more a procedural issue for me. You know, I wrote an editorial where I talk about the power company analogy. Imagine if you paid for your power a month in advance, and all of a sudden they shut off your power for next month, and they said, well, we're shutting off your power because philosophically we disagree with the fact that most of the energy comes from coal.
And that would be an outrage if that happened, right?
Certainly it would be. And we would say to them, well, you know, maybe I agree with you about coal versus wind or versus, but that's not the point. The point is I paid for my power in advance, and now you're cutting off my power because you haven't resolved your philosophical issues. That's not appropriate. And that's really what's happening now in Washington is that, you know, my paycheck and your paycheck are getting docked every month for taxes, and we settle that up once a year. But the fact is we're paying for our government on an ongoing basis. And for them to say that they're not funding government services starting the 1st of October is unacceptable. It's simply unacceptable. And we've paid a whole bunch of people to make sure that that budget process works smoothly. And it's not appropriate for them to let their philosophical differences get between us and the smooth functioning of our republic.
And in speaking of that editorial, you flat out state that there is absolutely no reason why Congress should be in the dilemma that they are right now. They've had plenty of time in terms of the recess that they took recently. You're saying they shouldn't have done that because things weren't resolved. Share your thoughts on that.
That's correct. I mean, the president sends a budget to Congress the first week in February, and this is a routine that's gone on for decades, you know,
it's not like, oh, I'm surprised. How did this happen?
Yeah, it's not a new process. There have been a couple of major evolutions. You know, in 1921, Congress passed an act that established the Office of Management and Budget, which is the President's budget organization. In 1974, the Congressional Budget Act established the Congressional Budget Office. So these are these two organizations that sort of are the keepers of the budget, the scorecards for the budget. But the presidential budget comes over to Congress the first week in February, and then they go through a series of hearings. There are 13 subcommittees in the Appropriations Committee that are each supposed to produce an appropriations bill for their part of the government, and there's no reason why that shouldn't be done by the end of the summer. And if it looks like it's not going to get done in August when they're about to go on vacation, I'm sorry, but you don't go on vacation at that point. The people's business hasn't been completed, and you don't go on vacation. Some folks on my Facebook page yesterday said, well, it's important for them to take that recess because they come back to their states and they see their constituents. But, you know, in my experience, congressmen come back and senators come back to their districts a lot. They come back almost every weekend. And there's also a lot of electronic communications so that we can communicate to them our preferences and priorities without them sitting in the same room with us or without them being back here.
Absolutely. And in relation to what's going on right now, and you say in them taking the recess and people thinking, you know, would a government shutdown be okay versus no, this would be catastrophic? Or I mean, I've heard both interesting theories on either end. But when it comes down to it, what would you say is one of the greatest misconceptions when it comes to the idea of a government shutdown? Because the word itself sounds kind of frightening, but when you get down to it, what is it really about?
First of all, I mean, I guess the thing to understand is that we're talking about the budget. When we talk about the budget, we're talking about discretionary spending, which is only about a third of the budget now. And so things like Social Security checks and those kinds of things are actually automatic, and they'll continue. They will. There's 4 different kinds of appropriations, and those things like Social Security payments are part of permanent resolutions that don't require ongoing legislation every year to continue. But then the other point that I think is a bit of a misconception is that these procedural rules that we're hearing about with Mike Lee and others using these procedural rules, those are not in the Constitution. So they're not using or defending the Constitution. What they're doing is basically using a bunch of procedural rules to hold up the budget over an issue that 57% of Americans, according to the National Journal poll, support. So 57% of Americans, it's about health care, I guess, is what's holding people up, although, again, for me, I like to use that generic example of the power company because regardless of what it is, if 57% of Americans say go forward with this, then the other 30 some odd percent or 40, there's 7% undecided, I guess, they shouldn't be able to hold up the government, to hold up what 57% of America wants. They shouldn't be able to hold up the process of our government. And that's not the spirit of the Constitution. And these procedural rules that they're using aren't even in the Constitution. Those are things that have evolved after the Constitution was written. They've been voted on by the members of the House and by the members of the Senate, and they've evolved differently in each body. But those procedural rules are not part of the Constitution.
So if there was an actual government shutdown, there's talk that it would cost us considerably if that actually took place. Is that true, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I don't think that it's going to cost us a tremendous amount. I mean, the fact is that you're going to have continuing resolutions that will be passed more than likely. Congress will act at the 11th hour, and you'll see one or more continuing resolutions that will probably fund the government. And so I think we'll probably avoid a shutdown. But just the fact that we're here, again,
it's even out there.
September 27th, and we're 4 days, just a few days away from the start of the fiscal year. We shouldn't be here. And there are a lot of good people in Congress, that are trying to do the right thing. But what I advocate in my editorial essentially is that next November, it's not an accident that this is happening in 2013. Okay, the election for Congress is in 2014. And they're betting, the people who are making these sort of calculations on holding us to this 11th hour political drama, are betting that by next November, by November of 2014, we will have forgotten this. And in accountability citizenship, I advocate each citizen getting a scorecard. I provide a job description for members of Congress, and I provide a generic scorecard. And it is a generic scorecard. I let you put your own priorities in. I'm not here to tell anybody what to vote for. I really am not here for that. But I think that it's important we keep a scorecard of what our values tell us and of some basic things that are constitutionally constitutive of being a member of Congress. And that scorecard, we should consult that scorecard next November. In my view, this failure, we should reboot the Congress. We can vote out 87% of Congress in November of 2014 if every one of us votes against incumbents.
And it seems that should happen because the percentage of Americans that are really upset with how Congress is doing right now is?
Yeah, 83%.
Yeah, so
according to the Wall
that
Street Journal.
should
Sure.
switch according to the numbers, but people need to get out there and actually
Yeah.
make their voice heard. That's a whole other issue.
Well, the problem is, we like to think of Congress as a bad thing, or many of us, 83% of us disapprove of the job that Congress is doing, but then we really like our congressman, or we like our senator, and he's a nice guy, and he smiles at us when he comes in the room, and he tells us all kinds of nice things. But the fact is that he's being paid to do a job with a group of other people. And if that job isn't getting done, then we need to change something. And I think the right approach for us to be thinking about as we go into 2014 is we ought to take advantage of this lever that we have that is in the Constitution. And that's the lever that we can replace 87% of Congress next November. And if we did that, I will bet that the 2016 budget will be on time. I would bet anything that the 2016
I think
budget
I'm
will
with
be
you
on
on
time.
that, and I think a lot of others would be as well. So we're going to go to a quick commercial break. When we come back, we're going to talk about how you can contact your congressman and some ideas and ways that this book, Accountability Citizenship, can help you in doing that. There's actually a couple of great tools right here listed in the back that I want to go over really quickly. So that's coming up in just a moment. We'll be right back right here with Stephen Tryon.